Hi, my name is Karol Kwietniewski and I would like to invite you to listen to the next episode of podcast of the Center for Propaganda and Disinformation Analysis in series Disinfo about propaganda and disinformation in media. My today guest, Givi Gatishvili, is a research associate at Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, where he researched influence operations and social media manipulation campaign in Eastern Europe and South Caucasus. Before joining the DFR lab, Givi worked as an international development consultant. I'm quite excited to give you some questions from the perspective of your research. So, what is your research?
I would say this is really busy time at my end because we have war going on in Ukraine, and we are just monitoring what's going on in Ukraine, but also not only there on the ground, but also in other countries which are affected with this war. And especially Poland, where I'm based now. And also my role is to also monitor developments in South Caucasus because I'm originally from Georgia, as you know. And I would say around 5 or 6 people from the EFRA Labs team now is focusing on Ukraine only. So we have two different research outputs. We produce Russian war reports once in a week, and previously we used to publish it 3 times a week. But then we decided to decrease the number of war reports and increase more in-depth investigations that we publish on Medium platform. And we right now monitor war crimes in Ukraine. We also analyze the main narratives about the war coming from Russia and other countries. We also monitor dissent in Russia, if there are some people who oppose the war in Ukraine and how Kremlin tries to clamp down on these voices. And these different types of research. We also analyze how different social media platforms respond to the war in Ukraine. And this is what makes our schedule these days very tight and intensive, I would say.
It sounds like a lot of work, but you are focusing mainly on Polish media scanning, right? Monitoring.
Yeah, I would say Poland and also South Caucasus. So regarding Poland, I have been recently working on monitoring anti-refugee narratives and how different actors in Poland try to revive anti-Ukraine sentiments. You know that Poland is the main destination for Ukrainian refugees. And some hostile actors in Poland and also outside of Poland, of course, try to capitalize on this situation. And just their objective is to change the positive public sentiments that currently exist in Poland and just making Poles more willing to accept the refugees from Ukraine. And this also is an attempt to basically creates tensions between Poland and Ukraine. And recently we have been monitoring different information operations which have the clear objective of driving this wedge between Poland and Ukraine. For instance, probably you remember a few weeks ago there was a false letter published by some anonymous actors, and as if it was a letter signed by Polish general, and that was an order allegedly which basically commanded Polish soldiers to invade western Ukraine and occupy part of Ukraine. And after that we also had false billboards that appeared in social media, and these billboards were saying it's time to remember Poland history, which basically implied that Poland should regain these territories from Ukraine. And then we also had a false BBC video, which was basically claiming that Poland is ready to deploy its troops in Western Ukraine. So this was what I call 3-stage information operation in order to, I think, scare off people in Ukraine as if Poland has plans to seize part of the country. And then there was also a response from Russian side. For instance, Maria Zakharova responded on alleged Polish plans of occupying Western Ukraine. And also recently, probably you know, Zelensky and Andrzej Duda signed the agreement on imposing some new rules on the border between Poland and Ukraine. And Zakharova said that basically Ukraine decided to voluntarily relinquish some parts of its territory and give it to Poland. And before that, before war started in Ukraine, we also analyzed different cyber-enabled disinformation operations from Ghostwriter, which also targeted Poland. And the main objective of those operations was to also create some disagreements and tensions between US and Poland as strategic partners. And yeah, I think Poland is a very interesting country in terms of the role it plays in the region, and also it is a very a palpable target for Russian disinformation as well as Belarusian disinformation these days. And we are closely monitoring what's going on in information space, what harmful narratives appear on a daily basis, and then we produce public reporting on what we see in information space in Russia, in Belarus, and also in Poland.
Okay, so you mentioned about your latest article, which is about the refugees in Poland, and you give us some examples of one of the release. You said that something is released in Poland and it's affecting Ukraine. Zakharova from Russia also speaks about that. Do you think, and I assume that you think this is connected, right? Those actions are connected and moderate probably.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this is how disinformation works. So first, some officials from the Kremlin make statements, and then these statements are amplified by pro-Kremlin media, and then we have a particular disinformation narratives that start to appear also in Poland, and there are different actors who are carrying out disinformation operation, and this is always a chain. So, and also sometimes it works vice versa. We have a disinformation operation, and then next day there are Kremlin politicians who are basically making statements to not just respond, but also kind of resonate with what was the main objective of disinformation operations. For instance, when I talked about this three-stage information operation about Poland having intentions to occupy Western Ukraine, once this information operation was conducted by still unknown actors, the next day, Speaker of the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, made the same statement that I can't recall the exact formulation, but he said that Polish plans about Ukraine is alarming, and basically what he implied was that Poland was planning to annex and occupy eastern Ukraine. So if you listen to Kremlin officials and politicians, they are saying the same as different malicious actors who are conducting these operations against Poland.
You are working on social media. Why the Kremlin propaganda uses this kind of source? I mean, I think people are thinking that this is mainly targeted to the younger generation, let's say.
There are multiple reasons why social media is an attractive domain for disinformation actors. And nowadays, I would say Telegram is the most convenient place for Kremlin to push its narratives, because mainstream Western media, social media platforms took down and banned a number of pro-Kremlin and Kremlin-controlled assets. For instance, Sputnik and RT were blocked by the majority of Western social media platforms, as well as YouTube and Google, so they are not able to formally and officially operate, but we still see that they try to bypass this ban. And for instance, recently we wrote a study how YouTube channels started to re-upload content from RT, and in particular RT in Spanish. So once Twitter blocked its channel, then new channels were created which started basically uploading videos to make it still accessible for users. And we have the same situation with other Russian TV stations. For instance, Россия Первый does the same thing, and also Russian NTV does the same. There are new channels which are now camouflaged, not clearly identifiable as connected with NTV or Россия Первый, but they regularly upload videos from these TV stations. And I mentioned Telegram. I would say that Telegram is a platform which remains accessible for Russians as well, and also for the Western audience and for Ukrainian audience as well. And while Russia cannot effectively use Facebook and Twitter to push its messages about the war in Ukraine, Telegram remains as the available option because it's not blocked anywhere. So, and then it tries to flood Telegram users with disinformation messages. And also recently I did an analysis of Telegram, and in particular Russian Telegram channels, because the Telegram is also an accessible platform for Russian people, because Kremlin also blocked Facebook or restricted Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms in the country. Yeah, and I found out that pro-Kremlin channels on Telegram gain new subscribers faster than those channels which are critical of the Kremlin. They also reach more people, and they are also more active in comparison with critical Telegram channels. And it basically means that Kremlin tries to be more active on Twitter than those actors who are against Kremlin. We also see some information operations that used, for instance, artificial intelligence, and we saw also information operations that involved the network of fake accounts. So, for instance, some of you may remember, our listeners, a few months ago, there was a network on Instagram, and these Instagram accounts were camouflaged as news portals from different Polish cities, and they posted pro-Russian and anti-Ukraine content. And luckily, they were removed by Instagram within hours. But again, Instagram was used to deceive people, because these Instagram accounts did not really disclose like who they were. They had a misleading identity on Instagram, and also they didn't really disclose what their main objective. So they were camouflaged as if like news portal from Wrocław, from Gdańsk, from Warsaw, but actually that was just a camouflage in order to hide the true identity, and they were accounts which were spreading anti-Ukraine content. And also, I would say that different social media platforms have different approach in terms of content moderation and how they fight against Russian disinformation. What I see, for instance, in Poland is that Facebook is quite responsive when it comes to taking down content which comes from the Kremlin or from pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian actors. I have seen some tweets which are very problematic, and Polish tweets, which are very problematic in terms of messages they convey. And these tweets still remain accessible on Twitter. They were not removed by this company. For instance, probably you remember in the beginning of March, there was a disinformation campaign against non-Ukrainian migrants in eastern Poland. And it basically started online, this campaign. There were a number of Polish Twitter users who posted false claim as if a pregnant Polish lady, was attacked by and stabbed by non-Ukrainian refugees who came from Ukraine to Poland after war started. And this was a false report. No one has confirmed it, but this tweet still remains accessible on Twitter. And I think it should be removed because it's false. And in addition to this tweet triggered also some violent groups to go there and start chasing non-Ukrainian refugees. So you probably remember that local football fans, like hooligans, gathered there to clean up, as they say, the city from undocumented non-Ukrainian refugees in Przemyśl. And these reports on Twitter were the main triggers why these people basically decided to do that. And then Konfederacja Party, of course, also started to add fuel on the fire, as we say, and just mobilize more people to start civil patrolling in eastern Poland. So the social media platforms have different instruments, like more like a soft instruments, or I would say soft tools to address this type of problematic information, and also harsh ones. Soft ones are, I would say, like labeling of particular content. For instance, Twitter labels Kremlin-controlled media as like a state-controlled, but when we speak about Facebook usually removes this type of problematic content. And as I said, for Kremlin now, some encrypted messaging apps like Telegram or Viber and also WhatsApp are more attractive because these platforms do not have very effective content moderation policy. They rather focus on privacy of users, and it allows hostile actors to have a bigger audience and spread the disinformation more efficiently. And on the other hand, open source researchers do not really have very effective tools and instruments to monitor conversations in encrypting messaging apps. And this is also something that Kremlin tries to use, meaning if there is no scrutiny on disinformation or effective scrutiny in the closed messaging apps, Kremlin almost has open hands to spread its messages through them.
So how those operations which are taking place in social media affect, in this example, the Polish society? You mentioned about the hooligans in Przemyśl who try to clear, let's say, this problem which was posted in social media. Any others examples? I think it could be also the panic with the buying of the fuel at the beginning of war, right? That could be also. But what's the characteristic of that problem in social media?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a lot of people still dismiss disinformation as a problem, and they do not really pay enough attention to disinformation as a challenge for the society. But sometimes we have clear examples when disinformation online translates into violence offline. And create some real life actions which are triggered by this information. And I would say that violence in Przemysl was one of the good examples, like how false content spread online can basically mobilize people who can commit some violent acts. On the other hand, it's very difficult to measure how and what is the impact of this information on people's attitudes. You know, we usually measure the spread and reach of information operation. We can see how many people were exposed to information operation, how many people reacted to particular disinformation content, but it's very difficult to see how it changed people's mind and how it changed the way they think and the way they perceive particular events or things. One way to do this, meaning to measure impact, is to do some regular surveys and opinion polls within the same segment of society in order to see and this segment should be, of course, exposed to this information, and then see how this information they are exposed to changes their sentiments and thoughts. But also there are many factors that come into play when it comes to shaping our perceptions, and it's very hard to see what is the role of this information in shaping our thoughts and perceptions. So this is very difficult. But what we now observe in Poland is that civil society and society as a whole still manages to maintain this positive messaging about refugees. So actors who spread anti-refugee narratives in Poland they have some marginal impact on public opinions. But we should also keep in mind that Poland in general is not a very welcoming society for all refugees coming from all the world. And we had situation in 2015, for instance, when there was a refugee Middle Eastern crisis or migration crisis, when Poland and as well as society as a whole was not very willing to accept refugees from Middle East. We had a situation on the border between Poland and Belarus a few months ago when again the majority of people said that these people should not have been accepted. But Ukraine is different, because for many reasons which I don't think need to be reiterated now. But my point is that this is something that we should still keep an eye on, because harmful actors can still instrumentalize even small existing anti-refugee narratives in order to basically inflate these anti-refugee sentiments in the country. And also it really depends on how government and different actors will try to deal with this refugee crisis in Poland. So far, I think that Polish people still strongly support to what government is doing in Ukraine, and they also support the acceptance of refugees. And again, anti-refugee actors remain marginal and not very influential, but we should not take this as granted, and we need to work in order to always expose what harmful actors are doing against people who come from Ukraine and how they try to influence people's opinion about current migration crisis here.
So to summarize, we can say that the goal of those actions is to start the social unrest in the society.
I would say not necessarily a social unrest, but they definitely want to scare Polish people consequences of accepting refugees from Ukraine. And for instance, recently I worked on Telegram channels and I identified around 27 Telegram channels which conveyed anti-refugee narratives. And there were different types of narratives they pushed. First of all, of course, they try to capitalize on benefits that refugees get in Poland, and they want to just make Polish people feel not privileged enough, and they try to portray Ukrainians as more privileged than Polish people because, nowadays Ukrainians receive all this financial support from Polish government. And what these actors try to tell Polish society is that, look, you Ukrainians get money that you should be getting from Polish state. And then also these Telegram channels basically push the narrative that accepting so many refugees from Ukraine can pose danger and threats to societal safety in Poland. And a recent incident on Nowy Świat Street was quite telling in this regard because that one Polish guy was killed by 3 other men. And from the beginning, some far-right actors claimed that these were Ukrainians who killed this Polish person. Also, Konfederacja Party started linking this crime with the arrival of refugees in Poland. And then Polish police basically clarified that people who committed this crime were Poles, not foreigners, and now Konfederacja Party doesn't even want to apologize for that. They kind of acknowledge their mistake, but they don't apologize, and they say that they followed and believed some reporting in the media. So it seems that anti-refugee actors in the country try to instrumentalize every single thing that they can instrumentalize and push false claims around it in order to just scare people. And also they push the narrative that other countries in Europe do not want to accept Ukrainians and why Poland should be accepting this. For instance, Telegram channels I mentioned push the claim that in Latvia, locals do not give apartments to Ukrainians, and in Litva they reinstated the border control with Poland because when Ukrainians try to go to Lithuania, they are not really welcome in the country, and reinstating this control on the border is the sign of this. And also they try to kind of disparage Ukrainian refugees as if they do some bad things in Europe once they come, or they spend this social money that they get from Polish state in buying some clothes. And I don't understand why is it even surprising for anyone that they need clothes. And so basically anti-refugee actors in Poland want to present them as privileged, as dangerous people for Poland, and also as people who do not appreciate all the supports that Poland and other countries show to them. And these are basically 3 main, I would say, groups of narratives that I observed these Telegram channels pushed.
I read some of your articles, and one of them is talking about the correlation between vaccination or anti-vaccination and the anti-Ukrainian narratives. Could you say something more about this?
So it seems that those actors in social media which currently disseminate anti-refugee narratives previously disseminated anti-vaccine narratives. And the Telegram channel I just covered did the same. So the majority of the channels I analyzed also pushed anti-vaccine narratives. And when I did the keyword analysis of these channels, we downloaded the channel history of these 27 channels, and then we analyzed what were the most mentioned words in these channels. And I found that vaccines and then keywords related to vaccines were mentioned almost 6 times more than Ukraine or refugees. And the thing is that these channels had been created much earlier than war started in Ukraine, and they were pushing anti-vaccine content. So, and then also my colleagues in Poland write about it very actively, and they have written it many times that anti-vaccine actors or anti-vaxxers now turned into anti-Ukraine and anti-refugee actors. So I would say far-right people in Poland were against vaccines when there was a pandemic, and now they are against accepting refugees and against Ukraine once Poland faces different type of challenge. And that's the basically correlation between these two.
You spoke a bit about Ukraine, which is, I think, right now the most important subject, also in social media, propaganda and disinformation. How is the war in Ukraine portrayed in Polish social media? How does it look like from the perspective of propaganda, disinformation coming from Kremlin?
I would say, if we speak about social media in general and not only malicious actors, meaning actors who spread disinformation, of course, the vast majority of social media users support Ukraine in this war, and Russia is definitely seen as very dangerous and harmful actor for the security in the entire region. And we see that probably Polish social media users are the most outspoken, the strongest supporters of people in Ukraine who struggle in this war. And if we speak about Polish, for instance, far-right actors or nationalist actors, they have quite sad position on that. For instance, I wrote an article in February, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, and I analyzed posts of the foundation called We Remember Pauline. And from the beginning of this war, they have been pushing anti-Ukraine messages. For instance, people behind this organization wrote on social media that Poland should not fight for Ukraine. Poland should not provide support to Ukraine because Ukraine committed a genocide against Polish people in the 20th century. And there were different lines of messaging coming from them. For instance, they claimed that Poland is a puppet of the United States and the United States is using Poland against Russia. And I also found a number of fake accounts which posted similar messages back then in February, but then we notified Facebook about these accounts and they were removed the next day. So I'm mainly monitoring harmful narratives and harmful content, and I can tell you that there are really different types of bad actors out there who are now trying to demonize Ukraine and just a year against support that Poland shows to the country. But again, this is really a minority and they do not get any approval from Polish society. And still, the vast majority of people here write supportive messages in social media towards Ukraine. Also, this is, I think, the right moment when people actually see how harmful these far-right actors are, because basically if people who have logical mindset and who understand how big threat Russia is, they also understand that these far-right actors should not be saying what they are saying about Ukraine. And this is the moment when Poland should show all support, because this is not just the war of Ukraine, but also Russia poses a huge threat to the entire region. And if Ukraine loses this war, then the threats that Poland is facing will just increase dramatically. And that's why it's crucial for Ukraine to win this war. And that's why the support from Poland to Ukraine is crucial. And when far-right actors are saying right the opposite, then people probably understand that this is very dangerous what they are saying, that Poland should not support Ukraine.
We are recording one of the podcasts in a series, Disinfo, and I have been spoken with other analysts from Poland and other countries in East and Central Europe. And it appears that this kind of propaganda and the narratives are quite similar in other monitoring areas. How you would describe the change of the narrative about Ukraine before the war and after the war, after 24th of February?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The thing is that Russia tried very hard to create pretext for invading Ukraine, and it has failed. Nowadays, this war is seen in the West and also in many other places of the world as totally unprovoked and unjustified war of Russia in Ukraine. It means that Ukraine hasn't done anything that would trigger Russia's invasion, and everything is seen as imperialistic ambitions of Kremlin, and this is behind Kremlin's war in Ukraine. But when I said pretext, Kremlin basically conducted a number of false flag operations ahead of invasion, and also it pushed a number of false flag narratives. For instance, one of the quite famous case from the period behind 24th of February also involved Polish mercenaries. So on February 18th, Donetsk self-proclaimed republic and its leaders claimed that Ukrainian saboteurs together with Polish mercenaries, tried to explode chlorine tank in Horlivka region in eastern Ukraine. And they also published a video of clashes between separatist army and Polish and Ukrainian saboteurs. So they published a video in Telegram, and they claimed that this video was recovered from one of the killed Ukrainian saboteurs who had a camera with him and was filming everything. The whole idea behind this false flag operation was to present Ukraine as aggressive country and try to portray Kiev as very hostile towards civilians living in eastern Ukraine, in Donbas region. So open source researchers verified this video immediately, and it turned out that video was prepared 10 days before it was published in Telegram, and it was not an authentic video. It was not filmed by anyone, but this was a composed, edited video. So audio was taken from YouTube video, and then someone basically merged this video content and audio content, and they created totally fabricated video in order to allege that Ukrainian and Polish saboteurs tried to explode this chlorine tank and the poison civilians in eastern Ukraine. That was one incident. And also there were several reports from Russia as if Ukraine bombed and shelled Donetsk. It was not confirmed. It was also false. So there were a number of false flag operations and narratives before invasion. But the main thing that we should know about these operations was that they were very low quality disinformation. What I mean is that basically evidence of these false flag operations were disseminated in Telegram, and Telegram is a platform which retains metadata of the file. So when you post something, a file in Telegram, then it also has metadata, which means that for open source researchers, it's very easy to verify authenticity of these type of files. So there were a number of false evidence with the metadata, and it allowed us to basically verify them and prove that Russia was lying. Why they did this so? Probably there are two reasons. Firstly, Russia mainly wanted to sell all this false evidence and fabricated evidence domestically for like a Russian audience, basically, who are really tired of talking or listening anything about foreign policy. And the Russian knew that they would not start verifying metadata, for instance. They would not start digging into details. And second reason probably was to create a fog of disinformation, meaning just creating an impression and perception that there was something really bad that was going on in eastern Ukraine. And some of these narratives that they pushed would work, but some of them would fail. And this is how it works. Like Russian disinformation it's not consistent at all. So they just create like a multiple type of falsehood, and they really hope that at least some of them would work, and they never have this ambition that all of them will work. So these were mainly about false flag operations. There was an important work done to create a pretext, but because of the US intelligence and because of very vibrant and vigilant open source community, Kremlin has failed to convince anyone that Ukraine was killing civilians in Donbas or Ukraine had any intentions to attack Donbas. And false flag operations and narratives aims to convince people that Ukraine was actually planning to do this. After Russia's invasion, of course, we have much higher volume of Russian disinformation coming every day from Kremlin and pro-Kremlin, Kremlin-controlled actors. And whatever Russia does in Ukraine now, and I mean mainly war crimes, almost in every case there is a disinformation narrative as if it was Ukraine and not Russia which did this particular thing in Ukraine. For instance, explosion of Mariupol theater was blamed on Azov, for instance. Then explosion of hospital in Mariupol, also Russia started to claim that it was Ukraine. Kramatorsk railway station explosion, again, was accused on Ukraine. Bucha, for instance, massacre in Bucha was also blamed on Ukraine. So war is going on, but this is not just a physical conventional war on the ground. Russia is also waging information warfare in this different dimension, and to that end, pro-Kremlin actors still keep creating fabricated content and fabricated evidence to basically now accuse Ukraine that Ukraine as if wants Russia to be seen as an actor who commits war crimes, and Ukraine, to that end, allegedly basically attacks its own civilians and kills its own civilians in order to blame this on Russia later on. But again, thanks to open source community who are now just working on monitoring everything in Ukraine 24 hours, we know that who is behind the majority of these crimes, and how Russia also tries to blame Ukraine on something that it has not actually done.
I think this is one part. I mean, you mentioned mainly about the propaganda and disinformation which was targeted outside Ukraine, but also they failed inside Ukraine, right? Because the Ukrainians are defending themselves well because also they weren't so infected. And it was, from my perspective, I believe that could be quite easily, the propaganda could easily make it better because the similarities of the societies, the language and so on, but they failed. Maybe that could be a hard question, but I would like to ask you this. You think this was procured by a lack of financial or lack of skills from the propaganda? I mean, both of them, because I believe they are connected inside Ukraine and outside.
I think there can be several reasons for that. First of all, I think Ukrainian government did a pretty good work to facilitate this nation building, especially after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And nowadays, country is definitely united and standing together, and they are not facing this huge threat. But we don't have the same situation as in 2014, for instance, when some people in eastern Ukraine, in Crimea, and also in Donetsk took Russian side and did help Kremlin to basically achieve its objectives. You know, when I was analyzing situation before invasion in Ukraine, I was really pessimistic that Russia would invade. And one of the main reasons why I was pessimistic about it was that Ukraine was united. And it was obvious that for Russia, it would be very difficult to achieve its goals in Ukraine when country is standing together. So my perception was that Putin and his people were adjusting its plans about invasion with what was going on inside. And inside the country, they were together. And probably this was also a calculation, or let's say miscalculation of Kremlin, that they invaded country when they were so united. And probably this is also the reason why they failed to take Kiev, which was, they now say it has never been their goal, but we actually know that they wanted this. And probably they wanted to achieve this goal with the help of some local Ukrainian actors who would, for instance, rebel against Ukrainian government, and probably they would try to take some of the administration buildings, and then it would be easier for Kremlin to basically seize Kiev. But it didn't happen so. Probably, as I said, this is very good work of Zelensky and his team, that they tried to communicate a very positive narratives about Ukrainian nationhood, and they tried to shape these perceptions of Ukraine as a united nation, as a nation who is very different from Russia and who deserves to be independent and who deserves to be free and choose its own destiny and its own foreign policy vector itself, without interference or obstruction from any other country. And now I think Ukrainians understand that their freedom is the most important. So when you have this understanding, it's easier for nation to find the common ground to be together, So I think nation and government work together in order to remain and being so united in the face of Russian invasion, and it made things very difficult for Kremlin. That Ukraine was so united, and there were not like local folks like in 2014 when they basically helped Russia to annex Crimea or also occupy eastern Ukraine.
Okay, my last question will be about the general awareness of the Western societies, how we can protect ourselves from such operations.
Good question. I think there is no universal remedy from the situation for everyone, but we should try to remain vigilant. We should try to verify everything that we read in social media as well as in traditional media, and just to question everything especially when it comes to war, we should also cross-check what we read on multiple sources. And also we can follow different organizations like mine, the FR Lab, and see what we write, what we report, and how we basically promote facts instead of falsehood, and then how we basically document everything. And we also explain how disinformation is spread through information systems. So there are multiple organizations in our field who are doing this, and I would say 8 years ago, when Russia annexed Crimea, the size of this open source community was perhaps, I don't know, it's very difficult to measure, but at least 10 times smaller than it is now. And back then, it was taking a lot of time, much more time than now, to debunk and verify disinformation. So, and then there are different multiple platforms where people can find objective information, even though there are also a lot of platforms and places where they can be exposed to disinformation. But simply, you need to have a critical mindset and just don't accept everything as truth. So when you read something, and if you take a small break and I count until 10, and then after 10 seconds, you should see if you feel about a particular piece of information the same way as in the beginning. So, and especially when it comes to some emotional content, this is a real trap. So if something arouses some emotions, you should really think about it critically, because disinformation actors really want to play with our emotions, and this is one of the signs how we can recognize false information, and also one of the reasons why we should verify what we write. So just my number one advice would be to be critical and verify everything what you read. Don't rely on one source only, and also always verify who is saying this. Maybe if it's RT or Sputnik, it's not really worth believing. But even if source is suspicious, then you can still verify the fact itself or information that these sources are giving us. And I think this will make us immune and protected from disinformation.
Givi, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Karol. It was my pleasure to share my thoughts and insights about Poland, about the war in Ukraine, and disinformation in general.
Givi Gigatishvili was my today guest. This episode was produced with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you for listening at this episode and encourage you to find our reports in the website capd.pl and our Facebook and Twitter channels.